is an emotional support mask, which is a Bucky mask. Um, and so that's great to see. So, in just a few minutes, top of the hour, we'll begin our weekly conversation about the work of evangelism and different interactions between preaching work, congregational work, and some of the things related to it. Before we get there, Bucky, how you doing today? You doing all right?
See, I think you misunderstand the importance of this mask. It smells faintly like brisket right now.
that's that's understandable. Given
So from that,
its source.
so yeah, so from that standpoint, you'd be wearing this mask too. Let's just throw that out there. It's just, I'm getting hungry right now. I don't know if I'll be able to do the work because I'm wanting to eat the brisket. That's going to be the issue we have.
So like, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, I bought a hat from Martin's Barbecue there in Tennessee. And
Yep.
I don't know, it had probably been hanging in that store for who knows um, how long. But it was imbued with the aroma of greatness that is.
Edwin is already complaining.
Yeah, it's all right. We fixed that for Edwin. That should be better now.
It's funny that I'm so easy to hear through the mask, and you, on the other hand, unmasked.
Unmasked, but the microphone was off in the distance, and I had forgotten to pull it down. So we fixed
Ah.
that. You couldn't see it taking place. So again, we're talking today a little bit. We'll get to this in a second. We're going to talk about gospel meetings. We're going to do a couple different angles to it, both from the perspective of the evangelist, but also talking about it some from the host side of things. But we'll get there at the top of the hour. Terry, just a quick question. What's your favorite thing at Buc-ee's?
Dude, you know what? That's a hard one. So I think my favorite thing at Buc-ee's now is bold and spicy nuggets. I think since they've opened up, I'm on my fourth bag.
I don't think that's a problem. I think I'll just leave it on the table that way. Right now, I think probably it's been a long time since my last visit to Buc-ee's. My next visit to Buc-ee's should occur, Lord willing, in a month. We'll see how it plans out schedule-wise. But my favorite Buc-ee's items, aside from the brisket everything, is the meat counter that gives you a full selection of beef jerkies. I think that's probably my personal favorite.
Well, so full disclosure, I've been to the new Buc-ee's in Leeds, Alabama once. It was on opening day. Okay, I did drive up there and we had a burrito and we bought some stuff. But Peyton's been working at a job site somewhat regularly at that area. And so we just have an agreement that if he goes to Buc-ee's, which he often does to eat if he's up there, he tries to rotate that around. I get a bag of spicy and bold nuggets. That's just kind of the agreement, or he doesn't get to live at the house that night. So that explains the 4 bags so far. Hal says I'm looking especially good today. Thanks, Hal. That makes me a little nervous that you said that, but there we go.
Well, let's get into maybe the heart of the matter in some ways. And what we're going to be doing is discussing a question that was brought by one of the folks who sometimes tune into our live feeds of this and listen to it later sometimes. And it actually stems from a conversation that took place earlier in the year, which oddly enough includes one of the folks who are watching today. I dropped a link for it in the chat, and it should show up across some of the things. But it was during our discussion of the Corinthian letters, and we began to discuss issues kind of related to fellowship, kind of related to trustworthiness. And in that, I presented one of the various ways in which you could begin to think through, hey, who should the church I'm part of reach out to serve in the role of a guest speaker, someone who would be participating in a gospel meeting, evangelistic outreach, whatever the various accommodative words that you want to use. How do you make that determination? Because it cannot be, at least in my judgment, a issue-based decision where there's this issue, and this issue for a number of reasons. And apparently, my volume is a ongoing thing. I'll have to probably get closer to the microphone. I don't know if I'm at my normal volume. Let me make one more change. Maybe that'll make it even better.
Here's what's interesting about gospel meetings, by the way. We get into this discussion because I feel like I need to fully disclose this. I mean, where I'm at and where I was at before, we don't have regularly scheduled gospel meetings. Hate to throw it out there. I sure like going to places in gospel meetings, by the way. You can send me a private message if you have any slots that need to be filled. I'm kidding.
Yeah. And then after you message me and I'll tell you why you shouldn't do that.
Yeah. This whole thing is really what Phil wanted to label this was why you don't have Terry Francis in a gospel meeting. But we made the decision to do more targeted series, maybe even more targeted weekends rather than traditional gospel meetings. So I just want to throw that out there. So if I come off as being anti-gospel meetings, it's not really true. It's just for the last 7-8 years, we've not done that at the locations that I've been at. That doesn't mean we've not had guest speakers, which I think is a completely different thing, by the way. And we'll talk about that.
Yeah, so I think there's probably a couple of things that I want to lay out.
I need to ask, by the way, am I too loud? Is that what part of the problem is? Because I can turn myself down. You all let me know. Anyway, go ahead, Phil.
Well, Terry, that's an easy question to answer. It's implied that Terry Francis is almost always too loud.
Really?
But let me see if I can adjust a couple things as well. I want to make sure that, everything is good. Maybe that'll probably be just a little bit better. But let's see. That should probably be fine now. At least, up to Terry level. Terry's like, whoa, it's too loud. So that's perfect. Terry can turn his own volume down in his ears.
I got to turn my volume down. Wow, that was crazy.
So I'll clarify some things. Clarification number one. Terry says much worse. You guys are messing with me. Let me just.
No, it is distorting quite a bit, by the way. They're right. I mean, you've got this weird. I feel like the first distortion amp, and you could see at Sun Studios in Memphis, where you busted the speaker and you shoved a piece of paper in it, and that's how you ended up creating distortion. By the way, there's a little music history for all of you.
We'll just go with this, and maybe this is better for everyone.
It's better. Turn your input up on your settings if it's not all the way up.
Oh, it's right about there, maybe, or right about there.
A little bit more. Well, give me more. Give me more. Give me more.
Terry, is this better for you now? Is this better for you?
Oh man, I tell you, for somebody who has so many spreadsheets and doesn't buy anything because you're like Consumer Reports, you're terrible today.
I don't know. Who knows what's going on? Too many buttons being changed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. All the chirpers are coming in from the audience.
I think what needs to happen here is Edwin needs to become our sound guy, and if you know Edwin, you know the humor in that. By the way.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I don't like that very much at all. I feel like there's probably
Well, let's get back to gospel meetings while Phil tries to figure out his sound issues.
I have no issues. Everything's perfect. It's wonderful. I think the problem's all Terry.
No, it's not. I am perfect and fantastic. And like, if you would just get something like this instead of that weird screen thing you use, probably would fix everything. We're good to go. Yeah, okay. Edwin wants everybody to know he's sound. Oh, great. There's another broadcast. How fantastic is that?
So here's some things to think about. And I'll probably lay this out this way. I think there's a priority tree, now that we've had the rabbit hole we've dug down, on how do I go about figuring out what I want to do? And I'm going to approach it for two areas. First, from the standpoint of the congregation reaching out to an individual and saying, hey, we need you to come help us in this effort we're doing. Historically, that model has fallen, at least in my perception, into a couple of categories. People you know, people somebody else knows, and that knowledge is incredibly limited. We know them because they are, and I'm going to use this very loosely, sound on the issues. That's a loose use because that's the only way you can use it. I don't think you can
Edwin wants
actually
you
use
all
it.
to know he's sound. Schedule him for a meeting at edwincrozier.com.
Yeah. And I think there's probably an unintended failure in that process. The unintended failure in that process is that how do we know we can trust the whole nature of that person, that when they need to be corrected, when they need to change their spiritual approach, hey, let's fix some things. This is going to do it. I think what we're kind of limiting the mindset to inevitably becoming a checklist. It's not that we started out with a checklist, we inevitably end up there because that's the only thing we can do if that's our sole metric for answering should we have person X or person Y help us in this endeavor. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, but back it up, and this kind of explains why where I've been has done what we have done. The whole metric X that leads to having this person actually begins with this other metric, which is in order to be classified as a sound congregation, you have to have 2 gospel meetings a year, right? So to leadership, what I want to say is, first off, back up from that and just look at the whole principle here of why you're doing this. And because here's my biggest issue with gospel meetings. Okay, I'm just going to throw this out there, and this is going to open up a lot of things, but it's also going to address what you just said. We schedule gospel meetings out for years. In fact, if you can look right over, I can't even do this most of the time, here over my shoulder, there on the whiteboard, that's my list of meetings coming up. I think I'm 4 or 5 years out on some of those meetings. So they've scheduled me for a meeting 4 or 5 years from now, where some cases, for instance, I'm scheduled where Hal Hammons used to be. Hal Hammons isn't even there anymore. And I was scheduled because of a guy who knew me from hearing me somewhere else, and that guy's not even there anymore, right? That's the only reason I got this meeting, and that's fine. But we scheduled those out in far enough away. Why? Well, because we have gospel meetings. That's what we do. But there's no purpose relative to that. Like, there's nothing tied into why we're doing that, okay? And I think one of the issues is we have these gospel meetings, and at some point we send a message to this guy and we go, hey, you're coming in a meeting, give us a theme. Well, like, I think, and I guess, Phil, that's kind of what I'm saying there, is we talk about who we trust. Part of the problem is just the methodology behind gospel meetings anyway. We're having them just to have them. Whereas if you said, we need to have a series of lessons on prayer. Who does a series on prayer? You might hear names like Ralph Walker, Edwin Crozier, and you might reach out to those guys, and then you bring them in with a specific purpose. Not because there's somebody's second cousin's husband, right, that preaches at a sound church, but rather because there's a purpose behind this. So, again, like you said, most gospel meetings, if you back up, the first thing is we're just scheduling them to have them because that's what we do. Okay? And then when we schedule them, we don't want to have the same guys, except for some places which only have the same guy, which always cracks me up. Like Dowling Road in Beaumont, Texas. I don't know if anybody knows this. They don't have any gospel meetings except with Don Truex. And they're pretty open about that, right? But the rest of us, like most places, we just have guys. And what happens is, hey, we need some gospel meetings, and people give you these names, like you said, it's all by relationship connection. And so then you schedule a meeting with Phil Martin, but you don't even really know Phil Martin. You don't even know what Phil Martin can talk about that's worth having Phil Martin for. And all of a sudden you look on the calendar and Phil Martin's scheduled to come preach a meeting in 6 weeks. And then you're like, what are we going to do? And so what happens in that case, Phil, is the guy calls you and he says what? Just bring your best stuff.
Yeah, I get 2 or 3 things. I get, hey, what's your best stuff? Or we need you to preach on this thing, which might be so far out of my comfort or experience zone that it's like, okay, now you've just laid 6 weeks out. Now you've laid what would take me 6 months to maybe get a good handle on, when there might be 3 guys that I already know that are tremendously skilled at that thing, whatever the thing is. It doesn't even matter at this point.
Yeah.
But that's part of the congregational process that might want to be rethought. Like, what are we trying to accomplish with this intensified evangelistic or edification opportunity? Because really, we often kind of say, well, they're the same thing. We're going to edify and we're going to evangelize.
They're
And yeah, you
not.
can do that with guys that are good at it, but maybe you're one or two guys who can actually do an evangelistic type series that's also really edifying at the same time. Um, and look, those guys exist, and those are 10, 12 talent guys. Like, they're the 10 talent guys who have also found two more talents at the same time. Um,
Yeah.
so here's my suggestion as a way to think through this, both starting again right now. I'm going to shift tables and talk about it from the preacher standpoint, at least from my perspective, in a second. Congregationally, in your role as an evangelist or part of the congregation, I would encourage this. Think about what you want to accomplish before you start just doing what you've always done.
Have a
Um,
purpose.
and that doesn't matter what the thing is, but now we're talking about our gospel meetings. And I'll make a simple illustration. It's probably been 15 years now, at the West Side Church on the west edge of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Stan Cox was preaching there and is still preaching there. They shifted their meeting schedule because it fit their needs. And what they did was their meetings were going to start on Saturday and close on Thursday, because they were scheduling their meetings during the academic year, which also meant it was during football season for a lot of their families who had young kids who were involved in football programs. And look, I said, look, it's not really meeting our goals. We're not going to do this Friday night thing where we're going to make our brethren make a choice between a commitment they made to a secular audience and a commitment they have to their God, when we don't have to. And so the
And that's
meeting
the
starts
key to
on
that, Phil. You don't have to put people in a situation to, quote, prove their faith to you. And I think that's the thing leadership needs to know about this gospel meeting trend, because the other thing is, not only do we schedule them out of habit, but we do Sunday through Friday out of habit because that's what you do. No, you can do this however you want. And as a congregation, you need to make sure that you choose in a way. Look, you have two options. You can make this a test for your membership, which I think some traditional churches kind of view this as, or you can do this in a way that allows your members to actually attend and benefit from it. And when you think about being a leader, which of those is what a shepherd would do, right? A shepherd is going to make it so that you get fed, right? That's the key there.
Right, and let me add some layers to that. So that shift is one way to think through it. And so if you're and this is for congregations with or without shepherds, doesn't matter. Lay out the school calendar, lay out the travel calendars, lay out the best calendar layers you can get, and make decided action. Not just, well, we always do it the second Sunday of this month, and so we're always going to do it that way. Maybe that's the great weekend, but at least make a decision about that, rather than let it become the standard. Standards help. Standards are valuable because it helps other people program their family schedules. They might be like, well, we always know we have a meeting this Sunday, so we always plan our family vacations a different week. Cool. But have it be a conversation rather than and just an accepted default. So that's on the scheduling side. That's
By the way,
one band.
on that issue, most of the times I've seen places that choose a certain week, it's because they're trying to accommodate other churches in the area and not have meetings the same time. Which, by the way, on the priority list is the last priority for what your meeting should be about. If your meeting's about edification, it's about your members' edification, and it should be about their schedule. If it's about evangelism, those other congregations aren't really a consideration. That's not meant to be disrespectful of them, but you're talking about people that aren't attending anywhere. And the reason why this is important is I've been at places where churches have a week, the school calendar changes, and they still have that week, and it's spring break. And they tell you that going in, and you're like, well, why are you doing it this week? Well, that's the week we've done it for 30 years. Change. Right. And I've been at a place, by the way, where that happened, Phil, and the leadership still decided to have it because there was like 2 or 3 different spring breaks because of all the schools represented. Hey, here's an idea. Get out of March. Don't have a spring meeting. Do it in February where there's no spring break. Do it in June. I mean, even in June, there's going to be summer vacations. But the point is, our traditionalism in this area ties us down and it makes us so largely ineffective. It's a bad practice.
Right. And so I would put those in the bottom of the priority tree. Like Edwin and Hal are kind of talking about in the chat. That's still valuable to have that interaction between brethren. And so it does, but that may not be the prime point. It may not be the number one thing. It's going to be 5, 6, 7 down the road, no matter what the subject is. Okay, and if we can accommodate it, boom, let's do it. Let's accommodate that. So we put that in the lower part of the threshold. Now we scale back up. Now we've got our scheduling. We know what we're going to do schedule-wise. But even before you get to your schedule, you're going to be in that dialogue space. What do we want to actually accomplish in the meeting on the sense of the congregation side? Topic, like if our goal, and I'll use this as another illustration, the most visitor effective special meeting that I've been part of was one where we had a special speaker who was not a regular gospel preacher on a special subject where he was perceived as being an expert in this little area. And it was very much seeker focused in that it was dealing with issues of conviction, faith, questions about origins, creation. And so we heavily marketed it to an audience that wasn't us. And we had a significant attendance of people who were not us.
Right.
And so these are things where you say, this is what we want to do. Evangelism needs to look like this. And so this is our subject. And we go find someone who is good at that subject. You know, all of those things have to be part of the table. So now we've kind of got that out.
By the way, the best
questions. By the way,
the best thing we ever did, I'll throw this in there, was about alcohol and chemical dependency. It was a preacher, but we brought him in for a Saturday and a Sunday, and the numbers were good, but the subject matter and the way it was covered was fantastic. People still talk about that because it was purposeful. And by the way, he's a recovering alcoholic, is very open about that. And you when you do things with purpose and with design and intent, they're just more successful rather than just practicing things because, quite frankly, that's the way we've always done it. And that's really what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So, and look, all the stuff like, Chris's questions are spot on. Like, ask, look locally and answer these questions, come out with what works. And, I've done Sunday to Sunday meetings before when I first started preaching. That really physically may not be the best answer, but in some areas it could be. Like, you don't just throw it out because you've been doing it. You evaluate it. What's going to be the most effective spiritual plan? Now, let me shut the table a little bit and talk about, let's get hone in on prepping for it from an evangelistic side, from the preacher's side. Stay within your area. Be okay with saying, hey, I'm not really the best on this. And in fact, here are 2 other guys who are much more suited to help this church accomplish your goals. It takes a lot of spiritual self-confidence to turn down a gospel meeting and give it to someone who is better than you at that thing. But if you start doing that, you will be blessed in the sense of understanding who you are. And you will strengthen your own sense of spiritual growth in that next phase. And Jay's got some other great questions. We might get to those too. But
so
that's one of the first things to do.
Let me say this from the preacher side too. One of the things you got to be careful about is that your gospel meetings don't become a source of pride. Okay? How many you have and those kind of things. And what you just said is that, you may turn down a meeting and tell somebody, hey, I'm not the guy for you. Here's somebody else. So the roadblock to that usually is gospel meetings become a sense of pride for guys a lot of times.
And let me add this. For some, congregational relationship wise, it's a portion of their annual income.
Correct. That is completely true. Okay. But the other thing about that, like I can remember one year I did 9 meetings and I had little kids at home. And one block, I was gone for over 2 weeks, and it was terrible in my family. And I learned from a college classmate of ours, Bubba Gardner. Okay, shout out, Bubba's not listening. He's not even on Facebook, so he probably not. Bubba's reading a book or mowing the yard in his French cuff shirt. Does Bubba use
a phone?
Bubba barely uses a phone, but Bubba, at the time, he and I were somewhere in a lectureship together, and he just said, he goes, I got kids at home. I don't do more than 4 meetings, period. And I made a switch at that point. Mm-hmm. I'm only going to do 4 weeks. That's all I'm going to do. I've been offered more when I go places. No. And at this point, for those, we talk about this often, I got 2 parents at home, okay, that need my help. And when I'm out of town, it's a huge process to leave town. And so, look, if I go on a meeting, my sister has to come in, or we have to find respite care, or my kids have to take care of their grandparents. It's a huge burden. I don't do more than 4. And it's not a humble brag, although nice nail there. Shane Scott Payton wasn't even old enough to know it was the happiest week of his life. That's funny, though.
Was it like last week?
Yeah. Chris Emerson says a humble brag. It's really not. It's just solid advice. The other thing I did, by the way, Phil, was when Peyton was a junior, I started telling these people that call me for meetings, I'm not going to be there on Friday night. I got a kid that plays college football. He has 2 years left. I'm not going to miss any of those games in the fall. Huh?
You said college football.
I mean, he plays high school football. Yeah, he didn't play college football. He plays high school football. I'm not going to miss those nights. I'm not going to miss any of his games because he was more important than me going somewhere else. And I've had places tell me that won't work for them. I didn't go because my son was more important. I'm just saying, in the process of this, these are great opportunities. I love traveling, but keep things that are important, right, when you do this. That's the other part of this.
Chris brings up something important that's a balance in there. When someone calls you, they very much want you for whatever reasons. And so you've got to balance this pass the buck concept, which sometimes the buck should be passed, to, hey, maybe this is an opportunity for me to do something that nobody else can do. And you're going to make some value judgments in that space. Like, you're going to have to work through it. And it's going to be a bit of a challenge at times to figure some of that out.
Typically, when I get called, they don't want me. They just couldn't book Chris Emerson, so they settled for me. That's what happens.
Yeah.
Because I excel less. By the way, can I just tell you, my son came home the other day, and he goes, and this is for Chris real quick. This has nothing to do with, he said, Dad, I started listening to Chris Emerson's podcast this week. I was like, oh, that's good. I hope you start excelling more. We'll see how that works out for you.
So let me, Jay made a little question about like the digital series stuff. I'm going to make a suggestion again on the preacher's side of things to kind of think through that also touches on the congregational side. At Eastside for this year, we're not doing traditional meetings, although we've done variations of them in the past. The weekend meetings has kind of been our format. We're doing a summer series, and we've set it up in that way so that it will be over the course of the summer, and it gives us a couple key flexibilities. Flexibility number one, we can do it in person or stream it. And so because we're going to also use a variety of speakers, we can do it in person or stream those. We can even stream those into our assembly as needed based on all kinds of factors. And we're trying to use individuals who are both effective in the area we've asked them to participate in, well studied to do so, and also meet the other congregational goals that we have as a congregation at Eastside. Now, on the preparation side, let me add that when you do a meeting, you should really be bringing the best you can do in that setting. And however that needs to happen for you, you need to pour yourself into that work. These are not the sermons that you scribble out on the way into the pulpit because someone called you up to preach and you didn't know you were going to preach that day. This really should be a representation of two things: your best work and your best level of humble approach to God. Whatever you can muster within yourself to really capture that relational aspect of being a disciple needs to be in the mix too.
You gotta bring your best work, not because it's your best work, because that glorifies God the most. And you're there, by the way, to do a job. Like, I think that's one thing I want to tell, by the way, the non-preacher, that this is a lot of work. Like gospel meetings are a lot of work. People at one time viewed that as me going on vacation. It is not. It's a lot more work, and it's there's a lot of stress that goes with it. You do that though, and the blessing, by the way, all of us that have done meeting work, the blessing is getting to know people. Like that's the greatest thing, is meeting people across the country, drawing connections. I go somewhere, I meet people that knew my parents that I've never met them before. There's a lot of blessings to it, but it's also a lot of work. But you're there to glorify God. And that's how it is every time we do this. So take your best stuff because you're there to glorify God. That's what you're there for. And I think that's just it should be like the foundational understanding all along, right, Phil? I mean, I think that should always be our understanding as we go through there.
And so kind of synthesizing down my comments to kind of attach into what I linked earlier on, the comment that came through in our earlier studies in 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. One, I want to make sure that the person we're reaching out to, or that I am rock solid trustworthy. That's the message translation of the text we were reading from at that point.
Which, by the way, is not an age thing, right? I think that's one thing to throw out. That's not an age thing. Don't think that we're saying young guys should not hold gospel meetings. That's not what we're saying.
They just need to be trustworthy,
right?
And that's something that can be gauged. It is.
And I've met some older preachers who aren't trustworthy. So anyway.
So number one, rock solid trustworthy. Number two, subject matter competence. That whatever we're going to ask of them, they're competent at it. They may not be the best, but they're competent. But now you've got the two things that I think are the most important two things. Hey, it's going to be, a trustworthy guy who's a competent speaker. Everything else after that is in God's hands at some level or another. It's in the category of God grants or gives the increase. Yes, there's individual efforts. Yes, there's all those other things, but they're all going to be balanced on what God can accomplish through a person who is trustworthy and is giving their highest level of competency in the moment. And Paul, in the past, by the way, I used to do the greatest hits thing. I do not do those by choice anymore. I will have pressured into that in some way. I prefer, on my personal level, to do thematic meetings that are either expository explanations of blah or things that fit together from exposition of the text, because that's what I feel like I'm good at. Like it's just that simple. Other guys do other stuff. Terry, your thoughts there, real quick.
Well, me too. I don't do the greatest hits thing anymore. In fact, if I'm gonna tell you what, the worst thing you can tell me if you call me about a meeting is to just bring my best stuff. That just makes me hang my head, because what I know is that you've done no prep work into this meeting. You just have it scheduled because that's what you do. You've not put much thought into it. And you're really depending on me to do all that for you. And I'm going to do that by having a theme. And I'm going to often send you a theme. I might even send you graphics to go with that theme. Like, I'm going to do that. But what it tells me is that as a congregation, you've not done any of that. You've not had any of that purpose. And I had a private message that somebody touched on that, where he talked about different ideas. Could be the verse of the year or what's being taught in classes, and going deeper in your meeting work and those kind of things. Like, that shows prep. Like I remember going to Franklin, and then later on going to Brownsburg when Edwin was there. And obviously I was scheduled just because of our friendship. But both times there was an annual theme, and I was expected to plug my meeting into a specific sector of that theme, and I was given direction. And that's when you know you're going to have a great meeting, because they've done a lot of work. Okay, the shepherds, the evangelists, they've done a lot of legwork into making this good. So you talked about make sure the guy's trustworthy, and make sure he's competent. All I want to point out is when you talk about making sure a guy's competent to handle a subject, that means you as a congregation have to have had a plan about what this is going to be. Whether your target's edification, evangelism, or both, what you want the theme to be, what you want the area to be. For instance, don't ask a single guy to come talk about marriage or raising kids. Like, don't do that, and don't leave it open. Here's the other thing. Think about this. Bring your greatest hit. Single guy comes in and talks about marriage and raising kids all week. Think how that goes over. So just make sure that, from that standpoint, from the congregational standpoint, you do the legwork to make this stuff work appropriately. That's That's because that's the only way to tie back into what you said, Phil, that you'll know whether this guy's competent or not. That's the only way you're going to know that for sure.
I think I'd add this. Shane has a little quick backstory about doing a series of evangelistic work in Australia. Most of the overseas work, I think almost all that I can think of, included phases like that, where you're going from location to location, place to place, preaching, teaching 2, 3, 4 times. And that's a different thing. The trips over the Philippines, a week and a half in Barbados, the other work that I've done have fit in that category for me. And it perceives as like, well, that's a vacation. Okay, I can see how you might understand that if you weren't there with us. Let me show you a little bit what we did, and maybe that will change your perspective. But most of the time, it's not. Anyone who works in a travel-centric business where they're on a plane doing sales work or consulting work for a business 50 days out of the year, they can tell you that vacation doesn't really come into play in the same way for them because it's work at that point.
Yeah, let me say this too. Let me pull back the curtain on the gospel meeting issue here real quick for preachers. Like I think people think of this. There's some sides of this that are kind of frustrating. For instance, when we go out of town for work and we're stuck in a hotel, our work is pretty much limited on at least the weeknights to, if there's a meal involved, to about 3 hours, which means we have 21 hours unaccounted for during the day. I don't know if you've ever been somewhat trapped in your hotel room for 21 hours. You can get a lot of work done, and that's what a lot of us do is we take a lot of stuff to read. Yes, I read. We take a lot of stuff to do, but it can become, it's not the same thing. When you go in a secular job, you're out of your hotel 8, 10, 12 hours a day. You're doing a lot of work. You come home. It is exact opposite of that. And I've been in a particular place multiple times. All the members work. There's 2 restaurants in town, basically, and the hotel is, 60 years old. It's not glamorous. It's not vacation in that sense. So, and it's just interesting to kind of see that from that standpoint. Not complaining. There's a lot of great benefits to going out of town in that circumstance. You can get a lot of work done. That's when I write a lot of material for classes and so forth, because I got a lot of time on my hands, right?
Yeah.
But it's not vacation in that sense. I'm not going to Disney World. I'm not canoeing. I'm not that kind of stuff. That's just not what happens.
And look, there's also opportunities for the gospel in those settings. You might be, some places you go, they've got you scheduled for breakfast, lunch, and dinner opportunities with different families. You might be staying in a home. There's a lot of unknowns in those settings. That's a good time to learn how to be a good guest, to be encouraging, listening. You can grow in those experiences as the evangelist. So again, thinking through a few more aspects of this. We've talked about it from the congregational side. We've talked about it a little bit from the preacher side. I want to encourage one more thing in that area, and is to really think about what is going to happen after the meeting. There's a lot of space between the guy was here for a week. We don't really know him. So our own efforts like on that side are great. Now we have 20 contacts or 10 or 5 or whatever. Here's a couple of things that I've seen be effective. One of the things you can do is create content that follows your meeting. And so maybe you've got a series of articles that are written that kind of tie together with what you've done. They can be sent out to everyone who attended. It doesn't even have to be the guy who did the meeting. But you've got a secondary academic connection. Now you also may want to have a secondary emotional connection. Who was here? Who knows who was here? Did they come with you? How can we encourage them to sit down for an in-person Bible study, an in-person spiritual conversation? What can we do to enable that? Evangelistically, that's important. Maybe the meeting was different. Maybe it's edification. Ask all the same questions, because the meeting might take place over the course of 3 to 10 days or a summer series, whatever it is. But the work of it actually takes place congregationally in the 2 to 6 months afterwards, where the boost of energy kind of reaches its zenith and then it settles into whatever new plateau you're going to find. Figure out a plan for that in your planning side, both congregationally and evangelist edge.
Yeah, I think one of the things, that, by the way, that we don't do a good job of in those settings is, first off, we've talked about preacher planning and sermon planning. It's a great time, whether it's on PowerPoint or whether it's in the bulletin for that week or whether it's in the announcements, to plug what's coming up, for those guests. Basically, you got to think about that opportunity if you have guests. How you going to run some commercials during all of that? Like, we don't want to think that way, but how are you going to market to those people? Hey, here's another reason to come back. Maybe it's another series that's coming up. But here's something to put on your calendar. We want you to come back. Like, you got to think that way. But look, sad thing is when you said what's the follow up going to be after the meeting? Like, the first thing that hit my head was probably nothing, and that's our downfall. Like, we don't do a good job with that.
I think that's
and that's the challenge.
poor team management when that happens, because nobody is responsible for that part of the congregational package. Even though people are, they're not accountable if they are. So, again, that's part of that conversational, let's plan for the evangelistic work, the edification work of the church to accomplish these goals. Who's going to be accountable so that we know the person who is responsible can then step up and say, hey, let's do this thing, and our thing's going to look this way. This is another great way to think through the thematic nature of your preaching and teaching, because it should be thematic in some ways. You can think through the impact of it in a couple other ways. And these are all the seed ideas. Like, you could take this and run 70 different ways on how Chris Emerson can continue to solve all of our spiritual problems. If we could just excel more evangelistically, I think we'd be excellent.
Yeah, listen, we pick at Chris Emerson. He missed for a call. But honestly, if I had Chris Emerson coming for a week, which we don't, because we don't do week-long meetings, one of the things I'm going to do with Chris Emerson is I'm going to try to figure out to have some kind of workshop on marking up your Bible when Chris Emerson's here. That's one of Chris Emerson's great things that he's done. And what I want to do, if he's going to come here, is I want to expose my members to that. And that may be just a separate workshop. I may bring Chris Emerson in early on Saturday, tell him he can't play golf that day, and have a Saturday afternoon couple-hour workshop for the people who want to come. But we're going to try to double up on that. One time we had David Banning coming in for a meeting in Memphis. What did we do? We brought David Banning in a couple days earlier, and what we had was a teacher's thing. And so we had a teacher's workshop with David Banning. When you have a guy that has some of these other areas that maybe you don't want to put in the pulpit in a gospel meeting setting, but you can use them in a workshop setting, use wisdom and double those guys up, right? Offer opportunities. And that's one way that you might bring Chris Emerson in. You might do something that's really evangelistic, but you might bring him in a day early, and you might have an edification focus for your own members about how to mark your Bible and let him cover some of that material. That goes back to, again, so much what we talked about was purpose, right? Purpose. Like, and that doesn't mean necessarily everything's a program, but maybe instead of purpose, what we should just start saying is think. Like, think through what you're doing. And that's, I guess, where I'm at on a lot of this stuff is. We don't think about gospel meetings. We just schedule them without any thought because that's what we've always done. And we've got to start thinking better about these kind of things.
Right. And, in a satirical way, we talk about things like, well, that's the local preacher's week off. Well, that's not realistic either, because the local preacher's probably doing 10 times the administrative work that they wouldn't be doing necessarily in that week because of X, Y, and Z. Like, there's all kinds of things.
And then you've got to entertain Chris Emerson on top of all of that while he's there. Like, again, there's things that people don't realize about that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of ways to think through this. So let me just kind of summarize my last thoughts as we close out our period of time here. Again, make sure you can trust the guy, and make sure he's going to be competency, and then make sure it integrates well into your congregational work from your side of things. Evangelist, the guy who's doing that work, the sister who's helping in these roles, whatever the context may be. Back it up and do the same thing. Make sure that you give 100% of whom you are to that work. Make sure that it's going to fit into that congregation's work in a healthy way, and do your level best. Um, in every ounce of that. And in the end, and this is something that sticks with me, it was actually I first kind of connected a few years back. Evangelism wise, in the end, realize God gives the increase. The more you understand that, the more you can actually pull apart the things that matter and make them run smoothly. And then whatever happens, happens. And it could be a great blessing to the local church when we start really doing each of those parts.
Absolutely.
Terry, last thoughts for you? Are we good? We covered it all?
I think so. Look, I was going to say this, though. Yeah, how Evans just said Chris Emerson is high maintenance for the whole week. Trust me. Look, I got it. Like, yeah, he's so picky about stuff. He has to have like a certain thread count in his sheets at the hotel. I was going to say this. I wanted to throw this out. This morning on the way into the office, I was listening to the Citizens of Heaven podcast with Hal Hammonds. We've kind of cross-promoted Excel still more sarcastically here this morning. But go listen to Hal's podcast this week, especially the first fourth of that. He talks about sheep versus cattle and the idea of shepherds versus cowboys. It's a great discussion. I think he did a really good job. I think he nailed that. And just want to throw that out there. Go give it a listen. It'd be to your benefit.
Let me close out with this. As always, if there's a way we can encourage you in your work, we want to do that. If we can answer any questions you have, please let us know. Also, we want to thank Adam Shelton for his question ideas. They've been excellent, and many others who have sent them in quietly. We really appreciate it. At this time, though, I think that's what we've got for today. We want to encourage you in your service. May God bless you in your work in Christ.